This lesson will cover the 18th through 20th chapters of Genesis, the account of God's judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah, the bizarre accounts of Lot and his family, and more shenanigans by Abraham. So we will start here with chapter 18, and we can see that what most interpret as what's called a theophany or manifestation or appearance of God, in this case by three people rather than one. And this is what a lot of commentators will take as representative of the Trinity. Abraham saw what he treats as three ordinary men, but the context is clear that this is God. Remember in the previous lesson that Abraham laughed to himself at the prospect of Sarah bearing a child in her advanced years. Now in verse 12, which I will show here, we see that Sarah laughed as well, also not out loud, yet God calls her out for this. For some reason, why he didn't call out Abraham, nobody knows. But God's response in verse 14 is one we should all remember. Is anything impossible for God? So trust is everything. This is what the whole righteousness of Abraham is about. It's about believing God and trusting God to know what he's doing. And that's pretty much the gist of chapter 18. And mostly the rest of it is just God having Abraham look around and see how far he can see, and that this would be his land. And then he talks about Sodom and Gomorrah and the manifestation, or whatever you want to call it, of God, this theophany, says the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah has been increased, and it's reached my ears. I've had it with them, basically. And he says, I will therefore go down and see if what I've heard is true, which is kind of a strange statement for God to make. But the next chapter will show that he sends angels down for this, that they are not him, that there's a different, they're described as angels rather than three men who talk as though they are God. And Abraham comes up to them and asks these questions about whether God would spare the city for the sake of a few righteous people. And he keeps narrowing down the number, and God says, yeah, if you find this many. And of course, as the next day would show, when the angels go down to visit, they couldn't even find that many, even 10 people, I think it was. So, Abraham, the Lord, it says that these three men are the Lord, departed, and Abraham went back to his tent. So we'll just go on to chapter 19, which again, as we said, that the three men have gone off, and instead there are two angels now. And instead of going to Abraham, they go right down to Lot to see what's going on. And of course, the reason this is necessary, the reason the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah have reached their limit, is immediately clear, because the men of Sodom are so evil that they want to rape the visitors, these two men, these two angels, that for as far as they knew were just two ordinary men. As was mentioned in an earlier lesson, these angels appeared to be ordinary men. This is how they always appear, and that's all that we get from the context as far as the description or how the men of Sodom treated them. They thought they were ordinary men. There's no way around that. So Lot goes out of his house and shuts the door behind him to try to dissuade the crowd that has surrounded his house. The whole city, it says, came around and surrounded his house. But what he offers them in place of the visitors is his own daughters. The casual reader recoils in horror that any father would say such a thing, especially one that in 2 Peter 2:7 is called a righteous man who was distressed by the depraved people around him. So I checked the commentaries, as anyone would do, on this incident, and they generally argue that Lot was either bound by the social custom of protecting guests at any cost, even by only trading one sin for another that is deemed less offensive to that culture. And they note what Peter said about Lot being righteous, but they make excuses for Lot being less than perfect, so to put it kindly, since after all he had chosen to live there. So he had his faults, but some commentators are brave enough to not buy that excuse, but the fact is that we have nothing in this context to defend Lot, only the one in Peter that defends him. So, just to add my own speculation to the mix, I would go with what I have seen is the minority view that Lot was only buying time, since he knew the men of Sodom were not interested in his daughters. That much is obvious. They wanted to rape the men, they were not there for his daughters. So, if that's the case, then it would be like insulting someone who demands your car by offering your child's tricycle instead. In other words, he was just like, you shouldn't even be asking me this. I know I'll offer you something you don't want. And the reaction of the men of Sodom seems to support this scenario, since they say that not only will they defile the visitors, they'll do even worse to Lot. So they didn't take this well, and by this time the city had chosen to forget that it was only by virtue of Lot's uncle Abraham that they were still there at all. But that's also probably the only reason they had tolerated him living there, since they were known for hating all outsiders. So everything that history had told us about the area was that they did not take kindly to foreigners at all. So what was Lot doing there? Well, it probably had mostly to do with the fact that Abraham had rescued all of them, not just Lot. Why he was there before, no one can say, but I'm just taking what the text can give me here and what history can give me. And at any rate, at this point, none of that matters anyhow, because they were so incensed with Lot for not giving up his visitors to them and instead offering something they didn't want, his daughters, that all bets were off anyway, and they were going to force their way in. So at this point, the angels pull Lot back into the house and strike the men outside with blindness, who, it says, wore themselves out trying to find the door. That's how you buy time. They gave Lot a chance to plead with the men pledged to marry his daughters to come along out of the city. And I say pledged to marry because that's what the custom was, and you were considered married even if you were just pledged to be so. So the virgin daughters were pledged to be married, and Lot went out to try to persuade the men they were pledged to marry to come along with him. But they, the text tells us, reacted by saying that they thought he lost his mind, that they just laughed at him. But by morning, the angels had to literally drag out Lot, his wife, and his daughters by the hand so they wouldn't be destroyed. Even so, Lot begged the angels to let him stay in a little town nearby in spite of what the Sodomites had just tried to do to him. And remember, the Bible just honestly reports things. It doesn't necessarily explain or comment that what somebody is doing at the moment is bad or stupid or forgetful. So then fire and brimstone rained down from the sky over the whole area. This is by morning. But looking down here at verse 26 is where we encounter the account of Lot's wife becoming a pillar of salt. Some take the phrase looked back as more than just a quick glance, but rather a case of having second thoughts, as if she considered returning after the destruction was over. Either way, Scripture doesn't say that she was being punished by God for looking back. It's just that's the sulfur raining down from the sky, and she might have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Who knows? But Jesus said in Luke 17:32 to remember Lot's wife, but only in the context of someone who starts down a path such as following him and then looks back and has second thoughts. That's the example he's using her as. So it isn't as though that God directly threw a lightning bolt at her, is kind of implied by the picture we were showing here at the start. Whoops, not that one. That the artist's drawing here has this lightning bolt pointing right at her, and she has lagged far behind the rest of the family. So, but that's speculation. So let's look quickly before we go on that at the archaeological evidence for any of this stuff happening. Um, they open the article with a statement about how ridiculous a lot of people think any of these stories are, but um, it says they have a field day with the biblical event because it not only involves God's supernatural workings and cataclysmic acts of nature, it also represents God's righteous judgment. That's the part that people don't like. Even some, as they point out, Christian writers don't like this, or Christians in general. But if there's evidence, then it's not so ridiculous after all, and there is evidence. And here's a very brief, sketchy map of the area, but this name up here is thought to be the more modern name of the area that was Sodom and Gomorrah. In this area, here's the Dead or Salt Sea. And this area, they say, has fault lines and a large deposit of, I think they called it bitumen or something like that, something very flammable, and that it's buried under a large amount of this kind of material and debris, and they've dug down and found evidence of cities there because they happen to notice in the area that a lot of well-preserved artifacts were being flooded into the black market. And so that's a tip-off that somebody has discovered an ancient site, and so they went looking, and sure enough, that's what they found. That's what they're saying here about Jordanian authorities in the early 1970s. And so that led them to what they call early Bronze Age graveyard on the southeastern side of the Dead Sea that was being plundered, and they followed these dry river beds in that area, and they identified 5 ruined cities that appear to be the cities of the plain mentioned in Genesis 14:8. That we, have seen that already. But the most prominent northerly one was called this name, this whatever you pronounce it, and that's the Arabic for Sodom. So then they go on to list the other cities and where they're situated on something called the Dead Sea Rift, a major plate boundary. They speculating, but still it has merit that God has commanded the rift ruptured, spewing great quantities of liquid and gaseous hydrocarbons high into the atmosphere, and these ignited, setting the whole region ablaze and covering it with fire and brimstone. The more popular secular theory is that it was asteroids or a meteor shower of some kind, but that offers just an excuse to reject the supernaturalness of this event. They can say, well, they just thought God was angry and it was just a meteor shower or whatever, but we have, the evidence is not necessarily that, but that it also had to do with what was underground. And so it was lit up and fire and smoke, as we saw in the text, and they say that here, that Abraham saw this from Mamre, about 20 miles away. And they say it doesn't come from a point source, such as a meteor hit or something like that, and it would be extremely unusual for a whole shower of meteors to actually hit the ground and cause extensive damage. We don't have anything like that really beyond what is called the Tunguska explosion back, I think it was, I forget what decade even, but a long time ago, that just totally wiped out a large area of Siberia and flattened a bunch of forest, and people speculate to this day what actually caused it, that or might have been an in-air explosion of some meteor or something like that. This evidence for this area is not that there was a single point. They're saying instead that this had to do mostly with what was underground and a fissure opening up, and they say that not even a single point such as a volcano would explain the evidence there, but it was along this linear fault. Cities were crushed and burned just as the Bible describes. The city of Sodom actually straddled a fault, causing half of it to fall about 100 meters, and no one survived. And they say today's numerous bodies remain trapped in the rubble. Again, this is hard to believe that this would happen from a meteor shower or something ordinary like that. And they say that, of course, we already mentioned about the fact that it wouldn't be explained by a volcano either. So they say also that there have been located city gates, crushed graves, towers, a temple, water supply, thick city walls, uninhabitable since the destruction. The remains were identified by Dr. Wood as Sodom and Gomorrah. And then this Dr. Steve Austin, who is more known, I guess, for recent studies of the aftermath of the Mount St. Helens eruption here in the U.S., studied the evidence, including the fault zone, the burn layer, the bitumen that erupted, and the city's calamitous fall to its ruin. And so the evidence is geologically that this was, in fact, a historical event. So, back to the text here, we're told in verse 27 that Abraham woke up that morning to see all this in the distance, the flames and the smoke rising as if pouring from a furnace. So it was very thick and black smoke. But instead of saying more about what Abraham might have been thinking, the narrative just turns right back to Lot and the famous account of what happened with him and his daughters. Now, keep in mind that these women, his daughters, were raised in Sodom. So their solution to the problem of, it says that they went and hid in a cave, that they didn't go to the little town they asked to go to in the first place. Anyhow, they went to hide in a cave. And it says in verse 30 that they dwelt in a mountain. So he and his two daughters with him, he feared to dwell in the little town, which was Zoar in the Hebrew, that's more familiar. And he lived in a cave. And so these women who were raised in Sodom decided that, well, we got no prospects for being married now, because obviously they knew their, what we would call fiancés, were dead. And hiding in a cave doesn't improve your prospects. So they came up with a solution that was obviously both desperate and ill-advised, but they did it anyway. And no mention is made as to what Lot thought about all of this after it became obvious that his daughters were pregnant, and that it was by him. And he didn't even know it. As the text explains, they got him drunk one night after the other and make sure that they were having children one way or another. So that was their solution. And the scripture doesn't really say much about this other than to report it. That doesn't mean God condones it. People jump to that conclusion, especially critics of the Bible will say that the Bible must be condoning this because it doesn't condemn it. And that, of course, is a fallacy known as an argument from silence. And there's nothing in the text to warrant God's approval of any of this. So what the scripture does say is that the older daughter's son was called Moab, who would be the ancestor of the Moabites, and the younger daughter's son was called Ben-Ami, ancestor of the Ammonites. And these will be familiar names to any Bible student, even a casual one, and they will turn out to be nations that will suffer God's wrath for their wickedness, which should come as no surprise, given the circumstances and the parentage and all that. But just to say this is where those nations originated, and that's the Bible's purpose in reporting it. So again, we see that when people act on what seems best to them at the time without bothering to ask God, or at least some people who seem to be wise, they can't complain about the consequences, which can be more long-lasting and far-reaching than we think. So again, these consequences, as with Sarah giving her handmaid Hagar to Abraham to hurry God's plan along, that didn't work out so well. And now here are nations who would also be enemies of Israel in the future. Okay, so let's go on to chapter 20 now. And we'll go back to Abraham here, who at times seems to have the memory of a goldfish. He moves away to a new area, but along the way he comes to a city where he's again afraid they'll kill him to get Sarah for themselves. So he repeats his plan to pass her off to the local king as his sister. Not surprisingly, he gets the same result. The king is irate at Abraham for bringing potential disaster upon him and his kingdom, and as the text will say, God had closed the wombs of his own wife, the queen, and all the women in the kingdom. They were just not having babies at all. So this should come as no surprise that Abraham is in trouble again for his little trick and wanting to save his own skin more than anything else. I mean, did he think that even the first time, did he think no one would actually touch Sarah? So there's clearly, Abraham is not being whitewashed any more than anyone else in the Bible. Any of the heroes are being whitewashed. Their faults are shown, and this is an indication, a characteristic of a fair and honest and balanced news report. That's what the Bible does. Anyway, but maybe after all, Abraham isn't as have a bad of memory or isn't being as dumb as we might think, since once again he leaves the place with riches from the king. So they're paying him off, and he's becoming very rich as a result. It's not the kind of business plan I'd recommend, but maybe that's why I'm not rich. But anyway, um, it's interesting to note that that after this, as he's sending them off, the king admonishes Sarah and her handmaids to tell the truth from then on, after Abraham said that he told her to tell this half truth wherever they go. In other words, it was in spite of the result the first time. Abraham wants to keep repeating this over and over because obviously he's getting rich by it, even though there's always the risk at Sarah's expense that she will be married off to some foreign king. Go figure. That's all I can say. But he tells them to tell the truth, and as far as I can recall, there's going to be no more instances of this sort of thing. But at least in this case, this heathen king seemed to have more moral and practical sense than Abraham, at least at this point. So that's pretty much what these chapters cover. And it's interesting that Abraham is still trying to uh, cover his actions by saying that she is technically his sister, his half sister. So he's saying, well, I'm not exactly lying, and she's not exactly lying. But of course, the truth is, not just the half truth, that he didn't tell them half sister, and she didn't tell them half sister. Because what's the other half? This is her husband, is the part that's really being left out, and that she belonged to this man instead, and the king couldn't have her. So he's still lying. That little technicality wasn't going to get him off the hook. And this verse 16 is where the king says, I paid off your brother. He calls him your brother, not your husband, but your brother. So you could kind of put air quotes around that. 1,000 pieces of silver, and that's the price of all this, whatever thy countenance means, of seeing a covering of the eyes. That's kind of an obscure phrase in either language, but and all the women with you, and speak the truth in all things. That's what he says. But I think it's just kind of funny that he calls Abraham her brother, because that's what they've been trying to pass her off as, his sister. So he's going, okay, take your quote, quote, brother, and go and take this money and get out of here and stop lying. Because, the king wasn't stupid, and he wasn't buying this lame excuse from Abraham. So everybody was healed, Abraham's richer, and off they go. But that's all there is for this lesson. In the next one, that the narrative will return to the issue of Sarah having her own child. We'll finally get back to that. So obviously time had to pass, 9 months. But again, there will be more tension with Hagar and her son.